charity in Mexico that works to defend journalists, because as many of you will know, it's a very, very dangerous place to be a journalist. And later on, we're going to have 3 Mexican journalists coming and talking about what it's like covering the very, very dangerous drug wars. But we're starting with 2 very brilliant artists and writers. Martin Rowson, political cartoonist and writer, DBC Pierre, novelist who won the Booker Prize for his fantastic novel Vernon God Little. And their talk today is going to be chaired by Alex Clark, who's a very well-known critic, journalist and broadcaster. She writes for The Guardian, The Observer, The Spectator, amongst many other publications. She's also a broadcaster. She's judged many literary awards. Please welcome them all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. Can everyone hear all right? You can see all right? You can see the marvellous cartoons on the screen, which of course are the work of Martin Rowson, and I'm sure that we will touch on them throughout our chat, and you can talk a little bit more about them. You've both taken this a little bit too far. Martin, you woke up with no voice.
I did. I woke up unable to speak this morning. Actually, it's getting much better.
Sounds good. The Day of the Dead is bringing your voice back.
It was sounding pleasantly to me earlier on. It's actually sounding far too lively now. But we'll work on that.
Pierre, you've just basically touched down from India en route elsewhere, so you are sort of immensely jet lagged, but I must say tremendously perky, and wearing...
It's called coffee. I'm going to join the police force after this.
And wearing an appropriate shirt. Can you show us your shirt?
My virgin. Santa Virgencita de Guadalupe.
Just, where did it come from? I know you have a story attached to it.
Okay, no, I really... I love loud shirts anyway, but I was... about a decade ago, the BBC made a show hosted by Alan Yentl, and they took me to Texas and to Mexico, and I made him buy it for me off the street market. Actually, I tried to get him to buy me a scooter on the BBC, and he wouldn't do it, but I settled for a shirt, so it's my memorial of Alan Yentl, Virgin of Guadalupe shirt.
And he had, obviously, you had gone to Mexico, you were making a program in Mexico.
I hadn't been back there for years.
You grew up there, and part of your growing up was there. Just to explain, you grew up in Australia, you grew up in England, and you also spent a large portion of your life in Mexico.
Yeah, mostly in Mexico, yeah.
Just tell us a little bit about that.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, it's the deep end of learning about humanity, I guess. I was there from the age of 7 into my 20s. And it completely, utterly corrupted me in just about every sense, but also gave me a fail-safe of love of people and colour and high volume and stuff like that. And I think it's what nobody figured out at the time of the Booker Prize, is that novel, which seemed to come out of nowhere, was actually a Latin American novel written in English, because of just high volume and excessive in a certain way, and that is the spirit that I got from Mexico.
Let's talk a little bit about that idea of excess and the grotesque, how it relates to satire, and in what sense it is a sort of response to death. I mean, Martin, this comes up over and over again in your work, doesn't it?
Well, it's actually...
And keep looking right behind you now.
I got death threats for that, by the way, which is quite fun. No, I just wanted to digress from somebody told me this morning something which neatly connects things together, which was about a Mexican cartoonist in 1928. He wasn't actually a cartoonist, he was masquerading as a caricaturist at a dinner held by the Mexican president to celebrate some veterans of the Mexican Revolution, when the Mexican government was going through a period of heavy secularization. And this person was a fervent Roman Catholic, and he turned up at the dinner pretending to be the caricaturist, drew the president. The president said, "That's very good. Can you draw another one of me to make me look even better?" And he said, "I can make you look really good," and shot him 9 times in the back of the head. And was then shot by firing squad, shouting, "Christ the King forever." So, I think that's a very Mexican story, but it brings in cartooning.
That is taking it too far.
That's taking it too far.
That's taking cartooning too far.
But as far as, I mean, you'll have seen from these, there's this recurring character who I've been using for, 25 years, of the Grim Reaper, and also with his chums in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Because obviously if you're a political cartoonist, you're dealing with the hideous, unfolding, cataclysmic appallingness of being human and alive, staring into the pit of human degradation on a daily basis, and trying to claw something funny out of it. And I firmly believe that, you know, we as a species have this fantastic evolutionary survival tool, which is called laughter, to help us cope with the terrible things. Which is why you look at the things we laugh at. We laugh at other people, as Sartre pointed out, a hell. We laugh at this disgusting stuff that pulls out of our bodies on a daily basis. That is shit. Otherwise we go mad with existentialist horror of the thought of the stuff pouring out of us. We laugh at sex and we laugh at death. And we're constantly laughing at death. I mean, most jokes are about laughing at death. And so I just thought I'd take that one step further. And these ones actually this has appeared so far in an American Underground comic. They're updated versions of Holbein's Dance of Death series from the 1530s. But, of course, death has been as part of European and global culture for centuries, the idea of the great level. That, you know, if you want a definition of satire, it is that they, like us, shit, and they, like us, will die. So how great they think they are. If you're feeling really miserable, and oppressed and depressed by this dreadful government, just think about George Osborne having a shit. And when you get out of deep therapy, you'll feel so much better. He won't die though, because you cannot kill that which does not live.
Tell us a little bit about death and in the history of cartooning, because it has been, it is ever present, it's been there.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I think those Holbeins are a kind of cartoon, they're woodcuts, but you know, the point is, it's a sort of rolling gag that you have all these characters who are filled with worldly glory, and he sort of goes through all of them. So it's popes, it's cardinals, it's princes, it's kings, all the way down to farmers, and you know that they will all be gathered in by death. So you have there's a wonderful one of a farmer who's ploughing his field, and death is coming along and grabbing hold of the plough and sort of steering him off somewhere else. So it's this kind of morbid slapstick, which is permanently there. And I do think the Grim Reaper is actually a rather attractive figure in some ways. He's got a nice rictus grin. He's got some nice empty eyes. And of course you can take it off in different directions. For the last year, I've always drawn Tony Blair as a skeleton, because it just seems appropriate. Because Blair isn't as dead, he's killed, he's been responsible for the death of more people than any other Prime Minister since Winston Churchill.
Yeah, do you think this obsession with death also underpins the novel? Do you think it's something that's recurred through the history of the novel and that is sort of part of a great kind of stream that you're sort of dipping your toe into as well?
Well, yeah, it probably underpins everything. I mean, sex and death. It was a joke, you know, when I was young, that you would only be interested in sex and death as an artist. There really isn't anything else. It's that the contrast against which we measure everything else. And speaking of old stuff, I was at a museum of death, a museum of funerary arts in Germany last year for the launch of a picture book, which a mad German photographer had made of different authors in cemeteries, which was an interesting project, but the obvious place to launch it was at this museum. And they had a painting, and I think it was 18th century. They had obviously all the various symbols. Grim Reaper, who's relatively modern. Before that, death was a woman who would come and dance with you. And also they had a really beautiful symbol painted on canvas, which was soap bubbles rising into the air to signify that some of the bubbles were big, some were small, some flew high, some crashed and burst on the ground, and that there was no way of predicting how big you were or how far you flew, when you were going to fall. Just the notion of we just don't know. And it's amazing what it does to us. It's, I guess, no surprise that everything's measured against that, because we don't know if our time is up today or in 10 years. Life seems to be increasingly built around, you know, that fear, hope, that kind of carrot, stick zone of, you know, approaching death at a steady or unsteady rate according to our behaviour.
Well, there is the idea that we can halt it. We are feeling increasingly that we're able to.
We are, but it's bullshit. Yeah,
It is.
it's bullshit. I was just telling Alex that I was with a professor just now from Trinity College in Dublin, who was telling me that if you cured every cancer today forever, the average human lifespan would increase by 4 years. And it was it was an interesting and impactful thing, because 4 years is really nothing. You know, we could just as easily fall over in the bath in that time. So it's obvious that we focus on. Certainly in novels, my first novel was subtitled A 21st Century Comedy in the Presence of Death. And the whole thing was about death. They were selling death. The media was doing death. The kid was running from death. Everyone in the book was on an immortality project of some kind.
And that has become something that the novel, which I suppose in a way has always been about a sort of battle with time.
Well,
it's about kind of racing time. I mean, Martin, you did a version of Tristram Shandy, didn't you? Which is a novel obsessed with time. It's about that moment of birth and then the kind of helter-skelter to the grave. And
well, it's taking 3.5 volumes to get to his birth, you know, so it's that obsessed with time. But also, of course, Tristram Shandy is about defying death, about fleeing from death. The whole of, I think, sort of volume 7 is sort of starting off with him running away from death. You know, he's actually coughing blood into his handkerchief, and he can feel death breathing down the back of his neck, and he's running away furiously from it. Actually, it's something Pierre was saying. I mean, I think, you know, our attitude to death is really weird and coloured in all sorts of strange ways, but mostly it's coloured by the fact that most of the people, I assume, in this room encountered death not nearly as frequently as a similar room full of similar people would have done 50 years, even 50 years ago, when, you know, all of us would have had siblings who would have died. We wouldn't just be experiencing people dying in old age, we'd be experiencing people dying from the age of 1 onwards. And so you'd have a culture which was sort of predicated on having rituals to cope with that, to stop you going mad. You know, apart from laughing at you, you have other rituals to stop you going mad. But if you look at the way our culture now deals with death, we have zombies instead. I think it's really interesting that one of the most powerful cultural memes at the moment are zombies. And I try to justify this to my children who are in their 20s, who happily spend their time killing zombies. And I said, the only reason why you're doing that is because you're releasing your inner urge to commit genocide. It doesn't matter because they're already dead. And,
this is very much a kind of a sort of an idea that's gathering force, isn't it? I was talking to the novelist Alexander Hemon, whose most recent novel is called Zombie Wars, and it's about somebody who is making, it's a failed screenwriter really, who's kind of making a film called Zombie Wars. And his contention is that the sort of recent gathering of the obsession with zombies is about a form of distancing other people we don't like. It might be migrants, it might be the political classes we deal with. It's othering in a way. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think it is. I think it's, as I said, it's fulfilling our need to commit genocide, but in a safe way. Yeah. I should say that this last election we had, which was without question the worst general election, not the result, but the conduct of it, was the worst general election of my professional lifetime, which is 35 years old. It is 35 years. Because it was nothing to do with us, it was just to do with them playing around and sort of taking selfies of each other. You know, Ed Miliband with his policy rockery and David Cameron posing in an empty warehouse and so on. But it was made bearable by the fact that I spent the entire period doing the artwork for the opening credits of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is something I'm enormously pleased about. I'm so excited about this, but you know, sort of, oh, can you go and deal with the fact that Osborne's made a speech? No, I'm too busy drawing some Georgian zombies. Great.
Are zombies something, do they tickle your fancy?
Zombies? Yeah, well, we are zombies. I think we already are. I see them as civilizing. For instance, I could write a novel about consumer culture, where in the end you discover that everyone is kind of a zombie.
And in what way can a novelist, you know, writing the kind of books that you want to write, sort of disrupt that? What's the kind of way that a novelist, an artist, a cartoonist can just shake that up and sort of say, no, wait a minute.
Shake up the notion of
Shake up
zombies.
the idea that we're just going to go helter-skelter through this. We're being
Well, it's
manipulated
really-
through a consumer culture. We're being
It's difficult. No, it's difficult. Well, that's the challenge. I've had a little crack at it, but I mean, satire is increasingly dead. You know, there's a kind of a blindness now. It seems to me that for all of our technological advances, we're very primitive creatures in ourselves. If you think the average speed of human progress is that by 2.6 million years ago, we were using tools. Right? They were just rough, like hammer stones and flakes, sharpened flakes. By 1 million years later, we had invented the hand axe. In other words, we sharpened the hammer, basically. 1.4 million years after that, we devised a handle for it and turned it into an axe. And so if you look at the entire span of our existence, it's completely flat until about the last 5 generations, and then goes up. The same span, our genetic variation from, let's say, chimpanzees, depending on who you talk to, is between 1% and 4% across 2.6 million years. We remain at about 4%, and yet we're on a vertical curve. So we're like tweeting apes in a certain way. And what the market has clearly learned is that we are primitive, and simple things like stroking your ego and promises of sex, promises of immortality, promises of gratification are extremely effective, whether you pay off on them or not. And, you know, I'm susceptible to it. And it's very difficult to break that down because that's how we wire. You know.
And yet both of you create highly sophisticated cultural aspects, right? I mean, a novel is a very complicated construct, isn't it, of sort of words, feelings, images, and associations in a history of that. The cartoons that you do, I mean, are nearer to sort of fine art, really. I mean, they are not blunt tools, even if they appear to have a very direct message. So there is some way that culture is not as flattened as we might feel, or am I being optimistic?
Oh, no, you're being absolutely correct. It is fine art, the finest art you ever see, in fact.
I agree.
Pierre said satire is dying. Satire is always dying. That's the point of satire. It is always on the point of death, but it never quite manages to be shoved into the grave because we are inherently preposterous creatures. And you know, in the kind of society we live in, which is consumed. Actually, the weird thing for me on the subject of death is they sell. If you watch afternoon TV, they sell almost everything on afternoon TV to old people who are approaching death, but they don't sell coffins. They sell incontinence underwear, they sell stair lifts, they sell saga holidays, they sell stuff to keep your false teeth in, they sell all sorts of stuff like that. They don't sell coffins. They don't actually make that extra leap. Because part of the nature of our culture is because it's a consumerist culture, it is also a vicarious culture where we have to live our lives through other people, through role models, people in adverts with straighter teeth than ours and better skin and things like that. And we do this about death as well. So you'll have seen chugging through here an image I did actually before Diana died, her pushing death out of the way of a patient, because this story broke about how she was visiting the dying in hospital because she was so sort of saint-like. But when she died, I mean, it was actually an extraordinary thing, Diana's death. And I remember at the time that in a hard-bitten realm like journalism, you had senior editors quite incapable of understanding what was going on. They couldn't work out what was happening because they weren't in control of it, and they hadn't created it in the first place. And what, in fact, I think was happening is after 20 years of neoliberal consumerism, where you can have whatever you want, whenever you want it, what people wanted was to feel magnificently miserable in the way you do at a good funeral. And they wanted to connect with other people. They wanted to emote in the streets. But it was also exclusively about Diana. So I was at the time doing a series of cartoons for the Independent on Sunday books pages. And every week I do another cartoon about something happening in the world, wonderful world of books. And William Burroughs had just died, the American beat author who was famous for his cut-up technique. Anyway, it was the reading of the will, and somebody was being handed a badly wrapped up leg. And so I'm glad to see Uncle Bill stuck with his cut-up principles to the end. And they pulled it from the paper because it was in bad taste, because it was about the wrong death.
It was just irreverent in a
It was
way
irreverent
that
about death.
that moment.
Yeah. You could only concentrate on Diana's death, and you couldn't actually mention death, because it was about Diana. Diana had come to encapsulate death. That was all death could be. And that's a sort of really, really curious way of dealing with this, I think.
But when you're talking there, and I'm sure you're right, that there was a way in which there was a very spontaneous outpouring, and people didn't know how to cope with it, and editors, you know, the sort of, I suppose, the commentators, commentariat, you might say, because they hadn't created it. And it got put down as sentimentality, as kind of mass sentimentality. Do you think that we sort of, in a sense, kind of pigeonhole things as sentiment? We fear sentiment in a way that's sort of unjust, really, because actually...
No, absolutely, I think it's unjust, because I think we need it. I think what those people emoting in the streets wanted was something else instead of bloody shopping. So they were told shopping was the highest possible human attainment, that actually they could weep with total strangers in the street, because that's a part of the spectrum of human relations as well. And also another, you'll see chugging through here, there is an image of, and it might be coming up any minute now, and I'll ask them to freeze it if it does. Hang on a minute. No, it's not there. Anyway, it's the one of Steve Jobs' funeral, which, if you've seen it, his coffin is an iPad. And again, it was complaints, a lot of complaints about that cartoon, below the line on the Guardian website. So, you know, this man is not yet cold in the ground and you're doing this disgraceful cartoon. I thought the coffin is an iPad was quite a good one. What they objected to was somebody in the crowd on their iPad was getting the grief app. And this was considered to be an appallingly bad taste. And of course, actually, bad taste is one of the ways we deal with the horrors of death. We make jokes about things which are horrific. That's how we cope. And then somebody actually found a link to the official Apple grief app.
Is there one?
Yeah, there was an official Apple grief app which you could download onto your Apple device, and it was a flickering candle. And you could hold your iPad or your iPhone up outside, at a vigil outside the Apple store, in order to show the depth of your mourning for this genuinely unpleasant man, who was just clever enough to... There it is, yeah, there it is. Grief app's down there. If you could just freeze that for a minute. This is the
and
grief
you've done
app
it
down
as a
the
very,
bottom.
you would not notice that if you were looking very quickly at the cartoon.
And, you know, he was clever enough to realise we couldn't mediate reality except through his rather expensive trinkets. And when he took over as CEO of Apple again, he cancelled all their charitable donations. Because basically, he was a complete arsehole. And yet, everybody had to sort of, oh, Steve Jobs. And he also speeded up his own, hastened his own death by refusing to take any advice from doctors.
Do you think that that was part of the sort of shock in his death? Because obviously he died very premature. I mean, he was very young when he died, really. And there was a sense that this person who had controlled so much about our environment, about the growth of technology, could not hold back death.
He should have found a way to download his soul.
Something like that. Do you think that was it? What do you think? Yeah.
The death thing.
Do we think we're now becoming to a point where we're genuinely shocked that people cannot push death away because, you know, we've got an app?
You know, things have really changed. You were saying that, you know, in the last 50 and 60 years, the experience of expecting some of your siblings and expecting your loved ones to actually die, you know, from simple causes, flu and stuff, which we've cured, was much greater. A little bit before that, of course, in this country, you had people would lie in state in the front room. You had the tradition of death masks and locks of hair, and the death was much more tactile and celebrated. And to the phenomenon of Diana it was almost as if people wanted to be pinched to actually feel something, because it's all so virtual. It's all press and TV, and they kind of, and they feel close these characters, and yet they've never met them in the flesh. And you know, the thing, it's as if it should feel meaningful, and doesn't. And you know, I think we're really looking for ways to feel it, and to see if we really feel it. And that's where Mexico, to get back to today, I find that as an incredibly healthy approach. And
what does that mean? I mean, in what sense?
Well, they're not only, in my mind, not only able to contemplate death and to keep its iconry around and to half expect it, if you like, they can also contemplate horror. That is to say, not just the notion of death and seeing someone depart, but also the possibility of violence, seeing the corpse. There's much more about a history of what I could say a Baroque approach to death, where it's tactile and it's there and in your face.
And you don't feel the need to sanitize it?
Well, just, yeah.
You're not able to?
It just seems healthy. It seems that you walk with the shadow of it much more present than we do here. Here we're aghast. You go to the doctor and get a diagnosis of something, which of course is horrific in any country and in any language, but there's just a sense that you're walking a little bit more with that shadow, with the possibility of outrageous fortune in a place like Mexico that celebrates its dead and absorb what they've done is absorb the notion and make it into an art form and make it into a fiesta and turn it into many, many different creative things. But it's always there. You know, we don't do death really, except we do violent death in games and TV, but we don't do the notion of our departure.
But we know that there would be no art, no writing, no literature, no visual arts, no music, no nothing really, without death, don't we? This is something that we know pretty much for sure.
No,
if we had an immortality,
yeah,
well, then art would stop, wouldn't it?
I guess it would. I guess we wouldn't have anything to do. It would all be about Katie Price.
All of it about Katie Price.
Yeah.
Everything about Katie Price. That's terrifying. Eternity of Katie.
Suddenly makes death a welcome option.
Yes, yes, yes.
Martin, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that death, as it were, has come to cartooning in a very kind of real and present way.
Well,
I mean,
yes.
it is an extreme, high-risk business in certain ways now.
Well, obviously, you know, in January the 7th this year, when my colleagues Charlie Hebdo were murdered, not just 5 cartoonists, 3 of whom were over 75, but many other members of staff, including the janitor. The first person who was killed was the janitor, Frederic Boiseau. I'm not quite sure what role he was playing in oppressing the people who killed him. But it's a weird sort of interplay that, you know, with alongside death and alongside laughter, there is always sort of offence that I'm sure people would think that this entire event is offensive because death is a taboo. You're not meant to talk about it. And people will use being offended as an extraordinarily potent, aggressive weapon, offensive weapon, if you like. Although I would argue that nothing is actually ever as offensive as killing somebody else. But I find myself in a sort of truly bizarre situation where my job is basically to sort of raise people's spirits in a rather black way sometimes, but you know, that's funny as well. Is to actually make us laugh in the face of death and all the horrors I was describing earlier on. And yet, now I have clumping behind me this sort of weird skeletal figure. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Bewdley Festival. Bewdley is at the end of a train ride. It's all I know about it. But it's a lovely place. And we were sitting in the St. George Community Hall, and there were 2 of Worcester Constabulary's finest there, and I said, what are they doing? He said, oh, they're here for you. But the insurers of the festival insisted that there be a police presence while I gave a talk about cartooning. just in case I incontinently drew the Prophet Muhammad and the place was stormed by jihadis. I don't think these two lovely people from Worcestershire and Constabulary would have been up to much that particular moment in time, but it's, in a way, it's exactly as it should be. I mean, in a way, we should be dancing with death. And certainly, cartoonists are always there pushing at the very edge, you know, with this kind of shock troops of satire, because what we do is visual, and just simply, when you consume things visually, it's much more immediate, and people tend to gaggle it as it goes straight to the reptile brain. But, you know, at the moment, I'm following closely the trial of a friend and colleague of mine called Zuno, who's a Malaysian cartoonist. He's currently standing trial on 9 counts of sedition and looking at 43 years in prison in Malaysia. Cartoonists are constantly being killed around the world, they always have been, because we are sort of pushing against the power. Which brings us full circle, because death, of course, is the ultimate arbiter of showing the meaninglessness of worldly power.
And writers, of course, not immune either. I mean, you know, think of, say, recent events in Bangladesh, you know, the death of bloggers and publishers. You know, it's something that is...
The truth, or one's perceived truth, has always been a very good reason to kill. And if you think about, you're speaking about an otherness, an apartness of the whole thing, look how sanitary we are about our own deaths as middle classes, you know, in this island off of Europe. And look how, what are we up to? 200,000 civilian foreigners that we've killed as a nation, deploying troops in the Middle East, and it's hundreds of thousands of people that we have, with an idea, managed to, on the one hand, kill, but on the other hand, ourselves become incredibly more sanitized, more fearful of our own demise. So we're, you know, the newspaper will be much more full of complaints about the NHS and our treatment by doctors than it will be about, you know, another 100,000 foreigners that we have shot and killed.
But by the same token, there's also, certainly in the media, the news media, there is a very, very powerful taboo that you are allowed to show as many dead foreigners as you like. You can never show a dead Briton. Certainly not a dead British soldier.
Because we don't die, right?
Because we don't die. But it would be incredibly bad taste to point out, you know, so on the one hand, you have a kind of sanitized cult of death. So all the Wootton Bassett stuff was a cult of death. And a memorializing cult of death. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying what it was. But at the same token, a lot of those coffins would have been empty because those boys, you know, 19, 20-year-olds, would have been vaporized. And they were empty coffins. But you're not allowed to talk about that.
So we knew it was symbolic. And
well, no,
nonetheless,
you don't know it's symbolic. You don't even think about it. What you think, if you think about it at all, underneath that flag, you think there is a sort of perfect, incorruptible young man who is forever young, because you sentimentalize it. You don't actually deal with the reality. Like, you know, one of these images here was A Freight Worse Than Death, about those poor people who died in that back of that refrigerated lorry in a lay-by. And you know, the shores of Europe are awash with corpses. And you know, somehow it's sort of bad taste to talk about it. It's only bad taste to do anything about it. And you know, but by the same token, I mean, I remember saying to the government's chief scientific officer, Sir John Beddington, as you do when you meet this government's chief scientific officer, who'd been giving a talk about overpopulation and about environmental collapse. And I just happened to mention to him, I actually know it quite well, about our attitude to things, our attitude to deaths. So while we were agonizing about Iraq, quite likely, because we've killed so many Iraqis, at the same time in Congo, there was a civil war in which about 8 million people died, many in the most horrific ways imaginable. Mostly because there were warlords fighting over the bauxite mines, so we could actually watch a football match on our phones. That's the reason. And I said, you know, well, nobody cares about that. And John said, well, of course they don't care about that. 8 million, you replace them in 3 weeks. Actually, there are so many of us that, in fact, we probably have beaten death because the idea of us being wiped out by some kind of cataclysmic pestilence is very remote, because there are just bloody too many of us.
Shall we open
It's depressing.
We're not depressing ourselves, though, are we?
No, after this you need music and tequila.
Shall we open up to some questions from the audience? I think we've got some roving mics somewhere. I think, oh, there we are. Joe, you are the roving.
I am a roving mic.
Who would like to ask Martin or Pierre a question, or both of them? Anything you like.
Otherwise, straight down the pub.
Okay. Don't worry, it's very early in the morning. Actually, it's not early in the morning now, is it?
It is early in the
It is.
morning.
Alex?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question for both of you. I mean, what do you make of there are thousands of dead in Mexico? We have, disappeared, and I mean, okay, death has always been part of culture in Mexico, but now we're facing a huge humanitarian crisis, and how do you relate as Brits to what's going on in Mexico? How can you even start? Where do you start?
Well, with horror, I mean, professionally, people always say to me, "Why haven't you dealt with this?" I can only deal with the headlines in the British media, sadly. So it's not a topic I've actually covered professionally, but I'm very much aware of it, and it's almost incomprehensible from a British point of view, because we like to have our genocide elsewhere. Genocide's too strong a word, but our mass killings elsewhere. And of course, this is about merchandise and about commodities which are going to end up here eventually. And it's just the free market gone wild, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think it is actually an exemplar of the free market, just without its guns. But it is truly perfect.
Well, it is particularly, I find it really offensive, because when I was growing up, a strange thing, the streets of Mexico City were probably a little bit more dangerous than they are today. Mexico City seems to be cleaner and safer than then. But the rest of the country was relatively innocent. And what's shocking is that this isn't the Congo or something. It's a very civilized country with a massive infrastructure. For all that there's, an imbalance. I mean, Britain is approaching that kind of imbalance of incomes and everything, and it can only be due. And the real tragedy is that it's a conversation essentially between Colombia and the United States, which got out of hand. The amount of money traveling through Mexico suddenly, you can trace it back to, if you go back to the 80s, George Bush Sr. Stopped the air routes into Florida for cocaine, which used to be the good way to get it in. And there's a fantastic statistic from the early 80s that in 1 year in Florida, there were something like 140 aircraft crashes of drug-carrying planes, which were due to chance mechanical failure. And if you take the percentage of airplanes that have mechanical failure and then calculate how many actually got through with drugs, and then of course there was an equal traffic of banknotes having to be sent out to, George Bush shut that, and the thing moved to the Mexican border, and that it just seems to me the traffic of influence and money is too big to ignore, and it's shocking. And of course, Mexico, maybe I'm stupid, maybe I'm naive, but I always thought they were an innocent party in this, because they don't manufacture cocaine, and at the back at that time they didn't consume it either, except for a few juniors in Mexico City. And it's really tragic. But now, of course, you've bought governments, you've bought officials, and drug gangs have split into just general crime gangs, and it's turned into a different kind of epidemic, and it's shocking. I don't know what, and the answer is in the United States, is what's tragic about it. Recently, like within the last 18 months, the mayor and his 11 top officials of an American border town were busted for trafficking, allowing the traffic across the border, not only of drugs northwards, but guns into Mexico. And it's a scourge, you know. It's a scourge. The US border's always been a little bit of a scourge for one reason or another. It sucks. I find it really offensive.
But the only thing that kept the City of London from total collapse was the liquidity of money provided by drugs gangs in 2008 in the crash.
No, apparently the money that travels physically across the Mexican border every year outstrips the global revenues of Starbucks.
Yeah.
It's like 60, 70 billion dollars.
You ought to sort of, you know, legalise it.
Yeah.
Let's have another question. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, Martin, you were saying earlier about having had a death threat for one of your cartoons, and then about this issue with the police thinking that you were a kind of dangerous person to let out in public and talk. And obviously, we had the year starting with one of the most horrific events we've ever had, with all the cartoonists, the editors and so on, who were murdered at Charlie Hebdo. And I remember your very chilling response to that. You actually drew yourself slumped over your desk, kind of struggling how to respond. So I'm wondering your profession has become a more dangerous profession, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, that was sort of particularly horrible in many ways, because in fact I had said to The Guardian, normally I just ring them up and say I'm going to do this and this and that's fine. On this occasion I gave 48 hours to say I want to draw a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, because I want to outmaneuver the Islamophobes. And I want to draw him with his head in his hands, so you won't see his face, wearing a Not In My Name t-shirt. And to their credit, they discussed this at the highest echelons of the paper and decided against it, which is entirely their right. I'm not self-publishing. But they've got to consider their staff in the Middle East. I got to consider myself. I had to check it with my family to see if they were happy about this. And my children in their 20s said they didn't mind whether I was kind of suddenly really sick with terror about what might happen to me, which was rather sweet. And my son did send me an email saying, if you get assassinated, can I be the person who does it? Which is rather hard. But then when I did this cartoon, and me describing the cartoon was slumped on my drawing board saying that, weirdly enough, some members of my family don't want me to die, just to give some of you a bit of a wry smile. And then I was roundly condemned in social media, this wonderful hole has been drilled in the side of humanity's skull to make the id squirt out. For being the most cowardly coward in the history of cowardice, for not drawing the Prophet Muhammad.
Really?
Yeah. All these people anonymously saying, how dare you be so cowardly? Because those people over there killing cartoonists, those people over there wanting cartoonists to die, actually. They wanted me to be a sacrificial victim for their own Islamophobia. And actually, I did invite them to draw their own picture of the Prophet Muhammad, stick it on their front door, take a picture of it on Facebook and publish their address. Not a single one did it. And it is sort of like the Colosseum, that we're actually yearning for other people to die so we can have a bit of a laugh.
Thank you. Do we have another question? If you would like to ask another question. I'm going to ask you then where you think this is sort of all headed. I mean, I said to you a little death. I said to you a little while ago, look, this the idea that death might be somehow put off, if not abolished altogether, but that we're endlessly engaged in these kind of life prolongation. I don't just mean medically, but sort of virtually, the way we try to make ourselves look, which is this holding on to youth. How does this impact on how we kind of create art, do you think, how we kind of talk to death and talk about death?
How we create art. There's a lot more death in art than there used to be.
There is.
If you take movies and stuff, we kill many more people.
It's very interesting. There was a series of, after 9/11, which again is one of these sort of iconic death moments, because all these blameless passers-by suddenly reduced to sort of sticky ash falling over Manhattan, and that was a sort of a major. Well, the reason why they did it was because it was a sort of iconic event. But at the time, having teenage children who would make me go and hire movies from the video shop, all these teen movies about death. Suddenly it became, we can suddenly obsess about death, because all these children think, death has suddenly intruded into our lives. Because that was the most visual event in human history. We saw those 3,000 people's remains billowing out over Manhattan over and over and over again. I think that actually quite soon death is going to become a wholly owned subsidiary of the Apple Corporation.
And what will it do in that capacity?
It will become an app. It'll be a death app, you know, you just press it when you're about 950, and you get downloaded into something else. I don't.
What about in your work, Pierre? You were talking about how death permeated Bernard Godlittle. You've written several novels and stories since then. It's something that you return to as they all have death in them. It's something you return to as a theme. It will not be put away. How is it going to continue?
Well, yeah, I'm a beginner.
What do you mean you're a beginner?
Writing. One day I might be able to write a very nuanced and subtle book where there is no death, but death seems to be the only story in town, and it does touch something. And literature exists as cartooning exists to touch the buttons that we can't do on the street, that we cannot do in polite conversation. It exists for the conversations that happen in the back of the mind. And speaking of 9/11, do you know what was fascinating? If you remember the early images of that, leapers, hundreds of people leaping from the building, those images were very quickly squashed in the media. People, that horrible choice of staying in the building and being burned to death, or just jumping out.
But also, it's interesting that those images of recognisable human beings were excised.
Yes.
The remains of those people, in those huge billowing clouds, full of the remains of those people, were not. We saw them over and over again. But also, I remember the next day, every national newspaper had at least 12 pages of photographs of those 3,000 people dying and their remains being scattered. And as I said, the most visual event in human history. The cartoonists were the only people who got it in the neck. People could write about it ad infinitum. You could see those images over and over and over again because they were captured by machines. May have been then manipulated and edited by people, but they were captured by machines. And the cartoonists were actually mediating events through their own consciousness, through their soul, if you like. And there were cartoonists who were told to draw about something else. They were told to deal with another subject. Some of them in America got a knock on the front door in the middle of the night from the feds under the leading of the Patriot Act, because it was, you cannot deal with this topic.
So there's
despite the fact we all know it's happened, everybody's seen it, you're not allowed to talk about it.
Because it comes mediated through your brain and you've made a decision of how to represent it, then that is the front to taste.
And also it's got the immediate tactility of human engagement, which you don't get from a camera.
But why is that in the front to taste when clicking
because
a camera is not?
Because we're human beings. It's a personal thing. You know, taboos apply to human beings. They don't apply to cameras. And it's the weird way we work. It's the weird way we try and control things.
It is very weird too.
It's truly weird. As I said earlier on, there are some people who would think just the very fact that you're sitting in this room talking about death on a Saturday lunchtime, admittedly it's raining outside, so there's not much else to do, would be in itself offensive. Shh, don't mention it.
And yet for both of you, I get the sense that if you were not constantly confronting issues of taste and decency and what is thought a fit and proper subject for somebody to draw or write about, you'd kind of go home, wouldn't you? You'd stay out of it. You just wouldn't want to do what you were doing, would you?
If we couldn't do
challenge
that,
taboos.
well, this is where organisations like PEN come into it, because there are plenty of people who aren't allowed to touch on that or any other subject. And Mexico, very much a point in case where journalists have to be incredibly careful. And the truth is a very dangerous subject in many places. So yeah, we're lucky to enjoy certain rights. Although it's worth noting that it would be technically now against the law in this country to write a novel that portrayed a terrorist sympathetically.
Bang goes Conrad's a secret agent, eh?
Yeah, which I always thought would be a nice idea to have the innocent.
Choice. I mean, who actually says what's sympathetically in that kind of context?
Yeah, would it be prosecuted? I hope and suspect not, but anything which could be interpreted as glorifying,
what about
supporting.
What about Samson?
Yeah. we should bring the test case.
We should bring the test case. Samson, clearly suicide bomber.
And on that resolution,
blasphemous note.
Tequila.
Pierre, your most recent novel is Breakfast with Borgias.
Yes, about death, strangely enough.
Is it
yes.
about death by any chance?
It's funny you should ask. It's about death, almost exclusively.
You have a non-death book coming
Yes.
out quite shortly.
A
don't you?
life book.
I have the dumbest book published since Caxton, I think. It's called Carol Carnage. It is willful, malicious mishearings of Yuletide favourites. It's so stupid, I can't even begin to describe it, but it should stuff somebody's stocking.
So Breakfast with the Borgias are very nicely alliterative titles that you've both come up
Titles
with.
are
Well
fun,
done.
they're the most fun.
Thank you so much, Martin and Pierre, for joining us. I think, Joe, what the next talk? Tell us.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin Rowson, DBC Pierre, Alex Clark. I think you've set the tone for the day on death. It's going to be impossible to follow your act, I think. We've got another talk starting in 15 minutes with Simon Sharma, Omera Arigis, and then there's more coming on later with Camilo Lara, who's the musician who plays with Mexicy, who's playing tonight, the actor Diego Luna. Then we have 3 very amazing Mexican journalists who will be able to talk more about some of the subjects that DBC Pierre and Martin Rowson have touched on, Alfredo Corchado, Joan Guerrero, and Sandra Nieto Rodriguez. And then we're finishing at 6:30 this evening with Thomasina Mears of Oaxaca, the lady herself who's behind the fantastic festival today, with Enrique, who she's cooking with just over there today, and another chef. So I hope you'll come back later for more talks and enjoy the festival. Thank you.